Mr. President, in the aftermath of Las Vegas, it is a time for this senator to reflect whether a shooting is like Mateen in Orlando, the nightclub. He was motivated as a terrorist, or whether it has been this remarkable recovery of Congressman Scalise and the attempted killing of Scalise by a shooter that was motivated by politics, or whether it is this massive massacre in Las Vegas, apparently by a shooter who is mentally deranged in some form. The fact is that massive amounts of ammunition with high caliber, rapid fire assault weapons is making this easier for whatever the motivation of the shooter is. And as a result, you get to the point of how many of these more do we have before you say enough is enough. And that leads to the subject of politics. Where does humanity be able to overtake the divisiveness of our politics so that we can come together and have a common sense discussion about what should be done? Because if we don't, and humanity does not overtake our politics, we will continue and it will be more of the same. And so I yearn for that public but also private discussion with our colleagues, because going down this road over and over again is not going to be the answer. And we really ought to say enough is enough. Now, Mr. President, I'm the senator from Florida, along with my colleague, Marco Rubio. We, of course, have been at the forefront of this terrible tragedy that's going on in Puerto Rico, and I want to comment on that. By the way, speaking of bipartisanship, there's a good example. Senator Rubio and I, when our state was hit by Irma, we spent 3 days together, going around together, showing that we were shoulder to shoulder to try to help Floridians overcome the tragedy that they had just had befall them. And so we dished out food together. We went and surveyed the floods. We went into the poor little cities. We went and thanked university students who had rescued elderly, frail when they were abandoned. We went all across the state. We were first into the day after the storm, into the Keys, seeing the destruction there. And Senator Rubio and I have been joined at the hip when it came to looking at what was happening in Puerto Rico. It was pretty obvious. Last week, a week had passed since the storm. In fact, the supplies were stacking up, but they were stacking up in the ports. They were not able to get out into the interior of the island, and the two of us were pretty strong in our words that you've got to get the most capable organization in to do that, when in fact it's almost like combat conditions, and that is the U.S. military. And so finally, Wednesday night of last week, they sent a 3-star general who started to get it organized and is now, we're seeing it distribute out. But it's going to take more, because it's an island that is just absolutely devastated. and it's going to take a long time recovery, and it's going to take a lot more money. And remember, these are our fellow American citizens. So we saw the devastation in Florida. It's now the continuing hardship is being told in Puerto Rico. It's a population that half are without drinking water, and only 5%, and this is 2 weeks after the storm, only 5% of the electricity grid is restored, and cash is in short supply. So whereas in Florida we saw the flooded streets, the downed trees, the crushed cars, the flipped over mobile homes, limited access to critical supplies like gasoline, and property damage was everywhere, and it was the entire state. What we're seeing is multiply that many-fold, and that's what we're seeing in Puerto Rico. So now we're working on a supplemental funding bill. Remember, back right after the first storm in Texas, we passed a $15 billion emergency supplemental appropriations. That's going to run out within the next few days. So we have to have another supplemental funding bill, and you can imagine how now it's not just Texas and Florida, but it's the Virgin Islands, it's Puerto Rico, and it's some other states as well. So we're going to need to help the people cover the cost of recovery, and we are going to need to jumpstart the local economy in those areas hardest hit by the storms. So, Mr. President, today I'm going to introduce a piece of legislation. I call it the National Disaster Tax Relief Act, which would give people affected by these storms some much needed tax relief. And this is in the shadow of the conversations taking place as we speak with a hearing which I've just come from the Finance Committee about future reform of the federal tax code. And so the bill that I am introducing today would do 4 things. One, it would let businesses and farmers immediately write off their cleanup cost, not just their replacement cost. So, for example, Florida citrus growers. In the central part of the state, half of the crop, and it was going to be finally a good news story on our citrus crop. Half of the citrus, buffeted by the wind, is on the ground. You go further south into southwest Florida, 75% of the citrus is on the ground. And so what this would do would allow the citrus growers to be able to write off the cost, expense, in other words, in the first year, the cost of removing the down trees, not just the cost of a new tree. And that is especially important to citrus growers all over the United States because they're already hurting from a plant disease, a bacteria known as greening, which kills the citrus tree in 5 years. And therefore, there are a number of these groves that have been abandoned, but it's valuable land. We need to give the incentive to the citrus grower to be able to go in and plow under that citrus grove and replant. The immediate expensing of that plowing under plus the replanting of what we think are hardier varieties of citrus to this, more resistant to this disease, this bacteria called greening. We think that would be a huge incentive to try to save the citrus industry, not only in my state, but in Texas, Arizona, California. There's citrus also in Louisiana, some in other southern states. Now, the second thing that the bill does, it gives taxpayers the ability to exempt state and local disaster mitigation payments from federal taxes. And it lets them save for the next big storm tax-free. And that would be in a catastrophe savings account. So it would allow people to save tax-free $150,000 to cover things not covered by insurance, such as Southwest Florida. There are a lot of seawalls that caved in, seawalls that are extremely expensive to rebuild and repair. This tax-free account would allow them to put away savings for that and other kind of cost of remediation that they go out, they try to save their home by getting tarps on the roof, making certain repairs until you can get the replacement and the insurance can pay for it. Expensing of those items in the tax code would certainly give that incentive. And the bill also includes extra infrastructure financing for areas damaged by the storms. For example, help to low-income housing needs and other infrastructure needs that are so important to economic recovery. And then the fourth thing that the bill does is it includes tax incentives for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and extends tax benefits that are available on the mainland but not in the territories, like the full child tax credit. Why should we treat our American citizens in a territory any different tax-wise on a child tax credit that we treat our citizens on the mainland, the main 50 states? It shouldn't be. It doesn't make sense. What's happening in Puerto Rico should concern every American. Governor Rosselló has warned of a humanitarian crisis if we do not quickly move to alleviate this situation. The Coast Guard is working with FEMA and others to bring in drinking water, other critical supplies as well. Additional work is being done to restore power. Generators are being shipped in to help manage the load at the airport. And there are 30 flights per day now, which is projected to grow to 60 flights in the coming days. And meanwhile, as the evacuations continue, we don't want to leave Puerto Rico in tatters. We have to rebuild. And that's going to be an expensive cost to pay. And so as we are going into a supplemental package for all of these storm-affected areas, what about, since the utilities in Puerto Rico were so out of date and so arcane, let's think creatively, like in remote villages. Let's supply photovoltaic cells to generate electricity as a backup, because another storm's going to come and the power lines are going to go down. Let's think creatively as we help these areas rebuild. We're working on this supplemental package to get additional aid to those suffering. And I'm hopeful that what I've suggested here as a tax incentive will be a part of that conversation. Mr. President, our country is hurting. We should be doing everything that we can to help it heal. And now, not only healing from coming out of some ferocious storms, but now another grim reminder that in America, we are not treating each other as we would want to be treated. And something is wrong in the psyche that whatever the motivation is, there would be mass execution. I hope we will turn and have a very serious conversation about the direction of this country. Mr. President, I yield the floor.